But first of all, I just want to spend a few minutes talking about a new research that we're releasing today. And David did talk about the issue of fiduciary duty. And in my time at PRI, and it's not an issue that any of you won't be unfamiliar with, but I've heard many claims from potential signatories, their legal advisors and their asset consultants that their fiduciary duty prevents them from signing up to the principles of responsible investment, that it stops them from integrating ESG factors into their investment activities, that somehow by doing so that they would be in breach of their legal obligations on maximising returns. But we all know in this room, of course, that when you manage people's money, you have an obligation to consider factors that have a material impact on returns over the longer term. And the belief is not only fundamental to the PRI, it's a proposition, obviously, that's backed up by extensive academic research. So last year, after more than a year of analysis on the issue, with our UN partners, we produced an extensive report on fiduciary duty in the 21st century. And it was really to end the debate once and for all about whether fiduciary duty is a legitimate barrier to investors integrating ESG factors. And the report, I think, has proved to be a significant catalyst to the start of breaking down some of the barriers, whether they are real or perceived, they are still there. And it found that in no uncertain terms, failing to consider long-term investment value drivers, including ESG issues, is in fact, of course, a failure of your fiduciary duty. And this year, we extend our analysis to Asia, because we know that many investors in the region have yet to begin to integrate ESG issues into their investments, and that in many cases, this is because the same outdated perceptions of fiduciary duty and misunderstandings of responsible investment and what is meant by responsible investment can still be prevalent in this market as they are in many other markets around the world. So today, the PRI, UNEP FI and Generation Foundation are launching our latest report, and it's titled Investor Obligations and Duties in Asia. And the analysis, it analyses the obligations investors owe to their beneficiaries in 6 Asian markets. And it looks at China, Hong Kong, India, Malaysia, Singapore, and South Korea. And while we're focused on only those 6 markets initially, we believe that our findings are really relevant to policymakers and investors across the entire Asian region. The more than 50 policymakers, investors and stakeholders that we interviewed for the project identified that there were 5 barriers to ESG integration in the region. The first was that there are different views on how to define ESG issues. The second was the perception that integrating ESG factors will compromise investment performance, all things we've heard before. Third was that investors have difficulty engaging with companies on ESG factors, given the structure of the corporate sector in Asia, where we see that there's many large family-run companies and family offices. And fourth, there are very few regulatory mechanisms that require investors in this region to integrate ESG factors. And finally, that the quality of ESG disclosure by Asian companies remains very low. And the report finds, however, that there are compelling national interest regions for policymakers and investors to embrace responsible investment across Asia. Integrating ESG issues will result in more capital being allocated towards better governed companies, placing investors in a stronger position to contribute to the goals of a greener economy and a more sustainable society. It'll also result in improving air quality, responding to climate change and providing for an ageing population. All become much more achievable, of course, when you've got investors who embrace responsible investing. And the report has made several recommendations. The first being that policymakers and investors must work more closely together to design new investment frameworks that embed ESG factors. And the report presents several ideas for regulation and legislation in each of the 6 markets. And second, the report recommends that policymakers could do more to clarify investor duties more explicitly and strengthen corporate ESG disclosure requirements. And this could be achieved by introducing stewardship codes, or in countries that already have stewardship codes, that monitoring the outcomes of stewardship activity should be done on a more regular basis. And finally, our research found that there's a role for sovereign wealth funds in signalling the importance of responsible investment to the market and to get all market participants on board. Really, it's one of those things where leaders go, the others will follow, and we've seen that in many countries. Naturally, the PRI and UNEP are already well placed to respond to the challenges that we've identified in the report, and we'll be working on them over the next couple of years, and of course providing platforms for investors in Asia to build their knowledge on ESG issues and the investment case for integrating ESG into their decision making. It's one of the reasons that we're here in Singapore trying to bring responsible investment to the Asian market. It's one of the reasons that we've opened office in Hong Kong to complement our staff in Japan and really start to focus much more on Asia. Through the Sustainable Stock Exchange initiative, of course, we're already championing increased ESG disclosure by companies listed on the regional exchanges. And really our collaborative engagements are working to improve the dialogue with companies on ESG factors. So it's not that we aren't already doing these things in this region, but there's obviously a lot of work yet to be done. So I'd really like to encourage you to read our report, particularly those of you who are interested in the region, as I'm sure you all are. I'd really like you to also encourage you to read our first report, Fiduciary Duty in the 21st Century. I think it's one of the most important reports that the PRI has ever produced. And I would, of course, like to thank our partners, PRI and UNEP. I'd like to thank, we're the PRI. I'd like to thank UNEP and the UN Global Compact who helped us on the first report, and I'd like to thank Generation Foundation for all of their support. We actually wouldn't have been able to do as much work as we have without their financial support, and we really, really appreciate it.